Hi, I'm Lucia Lee. I'm an educator and creative writer.
And I'm JT Neal. I'm an organizer, writer, poli sci nerd, and just a general geek. And you're listening to What's Wrong, Baltimore,
A podcast where we talk about Baltimore
the issues that affect the people who live in it.
and the implications they carry to all American cities.
Welcome. Hope you're ready to sit back and do some listening, because we're going to do some talking. So, before you kick us off, Lucia, how are you doing?
I am really excited to be back and recording for our podcast. We have a lot of things to talk about, so I'm just like ready to nerd out with you.
Dude, that is true. I'm also excited. I don't know, I've had a lot of good news in life recently, so this is just the icing on the cake. So, yeah. Also, I have a beard, and I really don't like it. But
Really?
yeah.
Oh,
So it's one of those things where you don't realize it's a privilege to even be able to have a beard. Like, not every man can grow a beard. Facial hair, yes, but like everything continuous. And it feels weird to sort of be like, I hate this, but I low-key do. If you don't take care of it, it looks terrible. So then you have to do stuff to it. It catches things and
I cannot grow facial hair to the extent that you can. But
it's
that's all right. I think most people feel it's kind of a nuisance to deal with it every day.
it is. It feels, I don't know, like my partner likes it. And that's kind of one of the reasons why it's still here. I'm gonna shave it off. New year, new face.
You had a topic in mind that you wanted to kind of share some thoughts on. What was that?
Yes, so I saw a YouTube short because, well, the algorithm gets you. And one of the people I follow, her whole channel is like, there is another side to the relationship dynamic between like a cisgendered man and a cisgendered woman. It's all been very interesting because she does criticize like other TikToks that people have, but it's never been like, men are persecuted. It's just, there's more to the story. And it was
Sure.
interesting to see a video, a short from her. And actually, she has like two or three about the 4B movement and how number one, her talking about it was men support this. And number two, the more fascinating aspect was she was like, from what I'm hearing, what I'm seeing, my viewership, is that the kinds of women who are like, I'm doing 4B, are not the kind of women that men who also support 4B would date or be in a relationship with. And I was like, that is an interesting thing to observe, to state, whether it's true or not, because I don't have her numbers. It was just very interesting to see approval but disapproval at the same time. And to realize that like 4B wasn't just like a localized event within a particular culture, that it was actively starting to spread. There are like CNN articles about it. Like more and more people, especially in Western context, in Western social context, are picking up on it and agreeing with it and participating in it. And yeah, I just kind of wanted to dig in a little bit. It was interesting to see it sort of starting to move into other cultures, right? Especially ours, which feels more permissive in some ways than South Korean culture, but at the same time, a patriarchal society is a patriarchal society, right?
Yeah, I think the danger of talking about cross-cultural movements is the lack of context that people have and the quick summation that happens where people are like, South Korean culture is just toxic. And, it is in a lot of ways. There's a lot of things that I think are set up against women in like more oppressive ways than in the United States. In my experience, yeah. But it's really hard to just make that broad statement of it's toxic and not also observe what is toxic about the United States at in the same breath. So I'm kind of curious to know, like, what are the feelings it evoked for you to hear about these things?
I agree with the 4B movement because it's not a contextless event. It's not like we're just doing this because we want to. It's like there is a specific reason and rationale that is both fair and valid that would cause women to say we're not going to participate writ large in basically the grift that is how our society is constructed. There is the performance artist and she made an exhibit that was just for women. And this
Remember,
like dude like sued to be like, well, you can't do that. And he ended up losing. And when I first heard about it and I saw pictures of it, I thought, this looks like a beautiful exhibit. I would love to see it. But
yeah,
also, I kind of get it. Like, there can be spaces where man is not allowed. Like, we've had enough. We've had enough. I mean, the 20th century alone is justification to be like, maybe you should sit this one out. But so the movement in general is something that I'm like, I agree, right? What these women are asking for in general is very feasible. It's very easy to do. It's something that can be changed. It's something that should be changed. And it's something that doesn't bother me, right? I am more than willing to just sort of take the step back because I don't know, coming as an African American person in America, there are lots of things that people get upset about when it comes to just sort of the context of race in America and like history. And what's always fascinating to me is like, dude, my ancestors were enslaved. Like, you can take the L. You can just be like, you know what? Our bad, our collective bad. We are going to
sure.
let you have this over here, right? Or we're going
Yeah,
to let you have that over there. And in the same way, it's like collectively, dudes, I mean, I didn't start this, but nonetheless, I'm a part of it.
right.
So,
I
yeah.
think, that feeds into what I think of as a fake minority mindset where you don't choose your battles. If you were really oppressed, you wouldn't be spending the resources you have to sue a woman to go to an exhibit that you're not allowed in, that you didn't really want to go to anyway. Right? So I'm saying, like, there's a certain level of choosing your battles that you are aware of. So it's a little it's a bit of a thing, but I also think that 4B as a movement um is not specific to Korea. I guess we should define the 4B movement as people opting out of traditional marriage and values, and having the stereotypical idea of a family unit where you have children and you get married and things like that. And they're just opting out because they are sick of the amount of responsibility and work, the literal labor that is offloaded to women, where they have to be professionals. They have to be earning income at the same time as they are in charge of most of the housework and the childcare and this and that. And conditions are just not favorable to that. So people need to stop expecting this from women. I think that in a sense expresses the basic idea behind 4B. And I guess my larger point is that the population has been declining because birth rates are dropping in various countries because it's just not like a fair arrangement for a lot of women generally. Even with incentives from the government, it's just like, this is a lot, that people are expecting of women, and people who bear children generally, and I think that's fair. But yeah, I think this is like a sentiment that people are latching onto because it's been happening in their own culture in a way too. That being said, there's specific factors in the Korean context that I think is not necessarily present in all the other countries as well. So I don't know if I should get into it now. Do you think this is a good time for a little history dive?
Heck yeah.
Okay, so I want to call into our focus two different social dynamics. One being Neo-Confucianism. And it's really hard for me to really condense what Neo-Confucianism is because a lot of these concepts are more systems than like a specific phenomenon or definition. So I would say each like national identity also has their own specific Neo-Confucian like interpretation as well. But basically the idea stems from Confucianism, which says that everyone has a part in society in a hierarchical structure. You need to do your part, do your duty to uphold a society worth living in. So it's kind of rooted in the idea of harmony, you know. Um, you can't have a good quality of life if you are in a constant state of war among different interests, right? You can't exactly have commerce if there's constant conflict. So in that sense, it does make sense. But I think the issue with Neo-Confucianism that has been developed in Korea in kind of like a national identity in opposition to Japanese occupation. So it's uniquely Korean, but the difference is that in other countries, Neo-Confucianism had a period to mature with a certain level of modernity.
Hmm.
Um, so that means that it probably adjusted socially as well to modernity, where people are working people regardless of gender. But Korea didn't really have that, and so the like hierarchical structure is very rigid in a way that we didn't have time to develop socially. If you think about it, the Japanese occupation was 1910, like 1945. Something that triggered that is American interference in Japan and Japan realizing, oh, we have to be an empire. And that led to, you know, the occupation and the attack of various Asian countries, right? So Korea, 1910, completely different kind of setting in history, right? To
Hmm.
1945, not their own country. Korean culture actively suppressed. The resurgence of Korean identity along with Neo Confucianism was important to kind of when a culture feels like it's being snuffed out, they hold on really hard, you know?
Yes.
And so that's kind of what that was in a sense. And then consider 1945 and 1950. 1950 is when the Korean War started. So literally like 5 years of being somewhat without major conflict. And then if you consider when the Korean War ended, it hasn't really ended. It's like a armistice, right?
Yeah.
And it continues to be unstable as as we see things developments with North Korea that like seem to threaten these things. Really, we have had no time to really develop socially these Confucian ideals. So we are kind of stuck in a past time without having really developed to adjust Confucianism to what is very modern life. So in that context, yeah, socially things are going to be really behind. We haven't had time. We have had lots of resources being poured into being a capitalist society, a hyper capitalist society at that, because post the Korean War, the policy around Korea was just the government's pouring investment into these chaebol companies, which are like the super companies that basically own almost 70% of the economy, but provide maybe less than 20% of the jobs. And all of those companies also are, you know, exporting goods to really gain influence worldwide and be known internationally. So in the context of all that, like yeah, there's a lot of progress that has been made and development that has happened in Korea, but socially not a lot of time for that to happen. And that's where we find this like butting heads of like men's right activist type people and feminists who are trying to make any kind of progress on women's rights. And this is currently in an economy where it feels like there's no upward mobility. There's no hope. You're just going to work and work and work until you die. Like I said, these companies are family owned, meaning these families stay owning like most of the Korean economy, and just pass it down nepotism style, right? So it's like the chances of you working your way up is so slim. You're working so hard, and the Neo-Confucian hierarchy subjugates you basically into being your boss's little bitch. This is a mentality that you can see a lot in a lot of these companies where the social pressure is extremely high. This applies to women as well. But with men, it's like there's a certain amount that felt afforded to them that there's no hope for now. And to be able to press women is kind of the only ground they feel like they can push
stand
back
on.
against. So, of course, this kind of happens. And it's not to say like women aren't oppressed, but the 4B movement and the general like feminist movement in Korea is pretty fractured in their stance on a lot of things. There have been some pretty radical feminist kind of groups online who target and expose gay men. Um, they out them just online and publicly as a way to get back at men. And it's like overall this is not helping the cause, but the desire to attack is what is being, manifested in these kinds of things that are just generally harmful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Um
funny. Sorry, go ahead.
no, I just wanted to kind of give that general background of like why this is popping off so hard. And every time any little thing happens, it's like it's a powder keg about to go off. If you think about the current Korean economy and what it's been built on being in the goodwill and graces of the American empire. I mean, if you look geographically, it's basically an island because there's North Korea right attached to that peninsula. There's Japan, which is a historical enemy. There's China, also historical enemy. And you can't be exporting through those seas right next to your historical enemies unless you have an agreement through American empirical power, right? So it's like everything is so dependent on being in good graces with the United States. Um, and you know, to keep giving context around this, I just feel like the land is not exactly usable for growing crops because it's so mountainous. So the current population in South Korea can't actually be sustained on the amount of land that is in South Korea. So even staving off mass starvation is so dependent on maintaining good relations with the United States because the population has just exploded. And now with the shrinking of the population just so extremely, like I saw this figure might not be exact, but for every person in Korea, there is less than one person being born.
I've heard numbers like that before. Yeah,
Yeah, so that's a very extreme amount of population shrinking happening to the
yeah.
point where it's like existential. Like Korea could disappear
Hmm.
within like 2 generations.
At
So,
this rate,
it's
yeah.
one thing for people to feel like, oh, I empathize with the 4B, like I also am on board with that. But it's also not realizing how extreme and existential the 4B movement is in Korea. Like we would rather not exist than keep living this way.
Hmm.
And it makes sense for this extreme response to an extreme situation that has persisted and changed from one extreme to another over centuries.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I think that's kind of a piece that's really missing when people are like, you go girl, it's not you go girl. It's more like you die and I die with you.
yeah. I was just gonna say it brings to mind my favorite Bob Dylan song, "Masters of War," which That's it's a Vietnam era song. He's specifically talking to like the people inside the US political system, how they were perpetuating war. It's like you've brought fear to bring children into the world. And anytime like Elon Musk or any of those people are like, oh, population rates are declining, I'm like, it's not declining for no reason. It's declining because what are we doing here? Am I a serf? I'm just supposed to have a baby and go work in a factory and die. There's no what reason is there for me to live? What reason is there for me to bring another human being into this? And so it's maybe that's also why I'm like I accept and endorse the concept of the movement because with that context, it's far more real, right? It's not just we're doing this because we're mad. It's this is not worth living in. And it's something that can be changed. It's not going to be easy, right? Like also, I always forget like Japan just kind of decided to modernize itself. Like it literally was like feudalism, America shows up and they're like, we've got to catch up, right? Like they skipped a century's worth of progress intentionally. Like they
Yeah.
pushed for that, right? And like the only reason Japan was in the Axis, like I low key blame like Woodrow Wilson for like everything that happened after World War One, because the only reason Japan did all of that stuff, the only reason why they became an empire, is because at the end of World War One, Japan like actually contributed in a very positive manner to the Allies winning, and then at the end of it, they were like, "But you're not white. You don't get to come in here and be a world power. Get out of here." And they were like, we objectively have the same volume of like technology. We have the same number of ships, the same number of soldiers. We took over part of Russia just because like we are your equal.
Yeah.
And Woodrow Wilson and his buddies were like, but your eyes aren't round like ours. So bye.
Yeah.
And that spurred them to be aggressive and imperial because they were like, fine, we'll just make our own empire, right? Like we're not going to participate in the old empires. We'll be a new one. And but that was all something they did. And it's easy to forget that they brought people along with them, right? Like their taking over China was they were a century ahead. And so they just kind of did it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of those like Batman situations where you created your own villains.
Right?
If you think about Germany post World War One, and also what you're saying about Japan, it's like, well, it looks like we created our own villains.
Yeah. Cause like I saw videos. This is a weird tangent, but it was like maybe 20, this was pandemic, like seeing a documentary about like what led to World War II. And like French soldiers were legitimately like, they were abusing people in Germany, like in German speaking peoples, like they would accost them on the streets. And it wasn't Germany was like, we've been disrespected. It really was, they would beat us up in our own home just because we were living here, just because we spoke our language. And it was like, okay, wait a minute. The context for this is like coming into focus. Like they weren't just, twiddling their mustaches like we
Right.
have to get back at them. It really was, I was trying to get bread and some French guy took it out, said it was terrible bread, like stepped all over it, and I have no money, so I can't replace it.
Yeah.
And then they
The
make fun
threat
of
of
me.
being
Yeah.
extinguished definitely messes with like entire national identity.
Yeah. I hadn't considered 4B being such a threat to identity.
Well, it is and it isn't. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's like an indirect threat, right? It's like I'm coming at it from the perspective of a man who's like, this is what I'm supposed to do. This is how I'm supposed to live. You know, I have to worry about my legacy being children. And now all of a sudden, that is not, that's not a pathway that's open, right? Like
Mm,
it is not easy in a world that needs to change,
yeah.
you know.
I think something I've learned pretty quickly just being online, and this may not reflect on in real life is that men online who talk about legacy are an immediate red flag. I'm like, legacy for what? Being a podcaster? Who even are you and why do you care about legacy? Like, you have to do something to have a legacy. It's not like your
Yes.
children who are your legacy. That's not fair to their humanity.
Yeah, it's like if legacy is what I've always internally defined as like what you leave behind. You can't really set out to make a legacy. You kind of have to just set out to do something. Like I hate it exactly,
Live
right? Like
life well.
I hate when like presidents are like, "Oh, I've got to leave this legacy." It's like, "No, you've got to do the job." Like a legacy is something that happens. We figure out where your legacy is when you're gone, right? While you're here, you've got to do something. You got to be about something. So
Mm,
what are you being about? Having children and like them having your name is not a legacy, right? That's
yeah.
not what it is. But at the same time, it's the only thing that you can aspire to, right? I've told this to a couple of other people. Like, there's an invisible patriarch behind every little boy who literally, from the time he starts being able to talk, moves his hands and does things. You can teach a little boy the right way to be and the right thing to do, but unless we change this invisible patriarch behind the scenes, the dad that you don't see, because like a father is very important for a little boy, that's very true, a father figure. But there's also this invisible one you cannot see, one that's indirect, right? Like Captain America is a part of the invisible patriarch,
Hmm.
right? He's the invisible patriarch. And I'm not just talking like the movies, I mean the comic books, the
Sure.
stories, the imagination. And it's something that even as an adult, even someone who's like, I'm cognizant of this, it's still something I have to fight. It's still
Yeah.
something that, due to trying to change what it means to be a man, have to deal with. And that's
Mhm.
from the Western context where this stuff is like openly discussed, right? I can't imagine what a South Korean man, just general middle class South Korean man, who's going to end up working an ordinary job, like a truly ordinary man, how cognizant is he of the invisible father? How much can he resist that within his cultural context? I hadn't even considered that until like just now, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
over here thinking about it
It's a
for me.
huge thing. Something that immediately came to mind as you were saying that is the fact that a lot of women who see Trump see their fathers in Trump. That's a
Hmm.
thing.
Hmm.
I don't know how to prove it or quantify it or capture it, but a lot of women who see Trump and decide for or against Trump see their own fathers in Trump. It's a weird thing. Yeah. But, what does that mean in the Korean context is another thing that honestly I can't speak to because I grew up here in the United States. I see a lot of tropes in Korean dramas. I see my own interactions with like older Korean men. But other than that, it's just kind of hard for me to say what really that adds up to. But I think something that I am reckoning with personally is holding accountability for my own dad and also having empathy for my dad, which is the hardest thing. I think it's one thing to have empathy and hold accountability for people outside of your family, but something about being in your family, you just fall into the same mold. Like you're just a kid again, you're kicking your feet and throwing a tantrum, and they're doing their own little behaviors that just you just revert back to that somehow, and it's really hard, but it's definitely something worth venturing into because the truth is, you know everyone has their own hangups about their parents, and they're just never going to be exactly the people you wanted them to be. Yeah. And there's a certain level of letting go at the same time as, pushing that you want to do around your parents. That's just really, really hard.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That was a good tidbit
Yeah,
about
you're feeling
parents.
it. You're feeling
I'm
like,
feeling it. Like that is very true. Like I'm gonna tell people that. That is true.
they're just never gonna be the people that you wanted to raise you, or that you thought that they were even.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say I have met people whose parents are pretty damn good. Like
Yeah.
I knew a guy when I the first campaign I worked on, and he was really cool. But like his dad was also really cool. And he was like, it was really hard being a teenager because he was like the perfect dad for a teenager. So every time I rebelled, he'd be like, "You do your own thing, son." And he's like, "No, Dad, you're supposed to punish me. You're supposed to make my life a living hell, not
You're
enable
supposed to
me."
be the antagonist to my protagonist.
Exactly. And so it was funny because he was like in his 20s at the time. He's like,
Yeah.
I love my dad and I appreciate him, but also like low key, I was just mad because he was like a good parent. He was not
Yeah.
grounding me and stuff.
That's
And
a
it's like,
thing.
yeah,
That's absolutely a thing. That push and pull with your parent generation and yourself is always going to be a thing. I think something that complicates my thoughts around that is we talked about this actually during the break, how there had been news of how South Korean agencies took advantage of comfort women or women who were prostituted out to both Japanese soldiers but also US soldiers. And so there would be a lot of babies born in like those kinds of situations that end up being biracial. And these agencies would coerce or falsely trick mothers into giving up their babies, pushing the agenda that they will be happier somewhere else instead of being here and biracial and disgraced and shameful. Turns out that these agencies were pushing an agenda to improve international relations by having these like mixed race kids out there in the world, and thereby having more like empathy towards Korea or like some connection to Korea. And there were women who were lied to who were saying that they were promised an open adoption, but actually the reality is their children were just taken away from them and they never found a way to connect with them ever again. And these agencies were making money off of the kids that they were separating from their mom. This is a kind of violence that honestly was endorsed by the American government that America has yet to acknowledge, actually, that American GIs were, impregnating Korean women forced into prostitution. And there are women alive to this day, like grandmothers, who struggle with this whole secret time of their life that is so shameful, or people put shame on it, like their family doesn't want them to talk about it because they're ashamed of it, and they're still missing their children, they're still thinking about their children. There's children out there who are still trying to find their mothers, and it's the type of violence that was enacted on Native American families, when they tore away their kids and sent them to these boarding schools that were essentially killing and torturing and traumatizing these children. So it's just a very unique feeling that I know is not common among various people of various races, where your country, your nations, my connection to South Korea and the United States as a citizen here, it's like both of these governments conspiring against people exactly like me, Korean women, and hurting their families, and doing this violence of wrenching children apart from their moms and their parents. And it's type of history that shows how little respect historically both governments have had to Korean women.
it's a special kind of wrong.
Yeah, yeah. It's not uncommon, but it sure hurts in a specific and unique kind of way.
Yeah, it's something I'm really glad that I grew up with the kind of family that I had that made sure that I was very educated about what like American slavery was, because that's is what happened to an American slave, right? You would have a baby and then they would sell it. It's not like they kept records or anything about who was sold to where, because you weren't a person. The baby wasn't a person. It was a thing. Something I tell people now, because it was something I just kind of learned from doing a little research. But Sally Hemings was a wedding gift to Martha Jefferson. Like, she walked into Monticello after being married with Thomas Jefferson, literally with a baby slave, who was, by the way, her sister, right? They had the same father. Like, TJ is what, in his late 20s when they got married? Because when Sally Hemings was like a teenager, that's when all of that stuff between them was. And it's like he literally knew her from a child, from a baby, right? Because she wasn't a person,
Yeah.
right? She was property. And that's just someone who has a name who we can remember, who's recorded, right? But the number of motherless children who just kind of had to go around. And then what's worse is they would have children and the same thing. And so you have this broken chain that no one in power was ever interested in, like, ever seeing it put together. Right?
Yeah.
It was intentional.
Right. And that's why it's so shattering to think about how only certain families are worth keeping together. Only certain families are valuable as an economic unit. Um, Not that I want families to be necessarily valuable as an economic unit, but I mean, I think that's what Confucianism really comes down to, in a sense, is that the family is a hierarchical structure that builds up societies, but the amount of value given to families has deteriorated. To the point where some people are taking families as a given and some people are just turning their back on the idea of a traditional family. And that's okay in a sense. It's a very loaded thing. I struggle talking about families and their family life with students here in Baltimore because it can be very triggering. But also, I think it's messed up to think about family as an option only for the extremely wealthy. Childcare is just kind of a nightmare all over the place, and especially in Baltimore City. People are struggling to get on waiting lists to daycare centers. Daycare workers' turnaround is kind of insane, and their pay is also even more insane. And it's reaching a point where we are neglecting to see family as a system of care. We're neglecting to see families, or we don't have that resource available as families providing care and that kind of labor. And we're entering into a time where there's a deficit of care. There's going to be only more elderly, and there's like record number of elderly in South Korea, and the system is just not necessarily built to care for all those people who have various disabilities and various abilities, right? And the idea at some point was like, my children will take care of me, but family has become alienated to the point where that's not a given anymore, and your children may have to work to survive. And that's the case with children and deciding to have children now. Like, you just simply don't know if you will be able to take care of that child or have the resources or the time or whatever. And that's really what it comes down to. Like, do we have enough people who will care for each other? Because not everyone will be 100% functioning all the time. You know,
Very true.
the privilege of being able to fall back and go live with your parents, that's actually a privilege. Some people don't have that. Actually, a huge amount of the homeless population are people who just aged out of the foster care system. Like, the healthcare system's collapsing versus being imported from the Philippines in these like contracts that trap them. Just all these things are leading to a deficit in care where we're just not sure if people will be able to take care of each other.
Yeah.
That's what is currently happening now. Like we can't hold down enough people as nurses. We can't hold down enough people as teachers. We can't hold down enough people in the positions that care for other human beings in the society.
Hmm. And then we have leaders and people of power who seem disinterested in that even being a possible reason, right? Like everybody's been talking about like all this stuff Elon Musk wants to do in the government, and it's like this dude doesn't know, right? Like he is a big proponent of like, oh, birth rates are declining. We have to do something about this. And he's never going to suggest making childcare cheaper. He's
Yeah.
never going to suggest better health care, better maternal health care.
Well, he's
Like,
one of those what do you call them? Like the breeder type
yeah,
people who just believe that like your gift to the world is having more children.
yeah. And he's like, oh, yeah, he's got what, 12 kids from a bunch of different people. And to
Yeah, and
him,
there's
that's
kids
like,
already who have already disowned him and have
yeah,
legally like broken their ties with him because he's just a deadbeat dad. And how embarrassing to be a billionaire and a deadbeat dad. You know what I
right,
mean?
right. And to be so desperate for people not to see him as that, you're not even interested in trying to understand why people see that. You just assume they're wrong. It's not fair of anyone to judge another person, except children have the right to judge their parents. Your children have the full right, and it is perfectly accepted. I wish it were more popularly like acknowledged and accepted. Like your kids get to judge you. They're the only people who can, right? And like Elon Musk's children have judged him, right? The ones who are old enough to do that. And as the rest get older, I mean, we'll see what happens, but I don't think odds are in his favor. People like him are whispering into the ears of people in power, and none of them realize that like the issue is care. Why should I care for a system that doesn't care for me? That only works if you are a literal slave. If you're a slave, you don't have a choice. But we
Yeah.
don't live in that world. And there are people who are willing to sign themselves into slavery under the assumption they'll get something out of it. But at the end of the day, if they eventually don't, what are they going to do? They're going to tell everyone else who's willing, hey, it's not worth it. And with
Yeah.
that, you won't even have people trying to sign up for the system. You won't even have people who are like, I should have 3 children because it's what I should be doing. Because they'll be like, what am I supposed to, I can't feed them. I can't get them health care. I can't,
Yeah.
I can't educate them. Right.
Yeah.
And it's like,
We're
this
literally
is
not investing in care
exactly.
when it's a basic human need.
And it's such an easy solve. Like investing in care would drastically change everything.
Well, the
And yet,
people who are generally policymakers are not the caretakers
mm-hmm,
because caretakers are literally working instead of,
mm-hmm,
working in the realm of minds and policies and
yeah.
concepts,
Like
initiatives.
maybe being the child of a teacher and seeing behind behind class time how much effort and energy and intention and care goes into it. But if I were a policymaker, I would be like, we need to give the teachers another raise. Just and it's funny, but it's also like the thing it would do is it would spur someone who's already a teacher to continue to be a teacher, to continue to put more into it because they keep getting more out of it. And it
Yeah,
would spur new people who would be
you gotta
interested.
invest in the people who work.
Yeah.
I thought that was what the whole deal was about, like why we are continuing to, import immigrants and then deport immigrants and also the transatlantic slave trade, like everything. It was about labor. And here we are not investing in labor.
Yeah. If the workers aren't paid enough, if they're not getting something out of it, who is? Who can get something out, right? Like in Nashville, we have this explosion of housing because we have a housing deficit, right? A lot of people are moving to Nashville. But the irony is that each new apartment complex that is built, they don't set the rent lower than average. They set it in the middle or towards the top. Like it's all luxury apartments. And it's like, how many people do you think are going to be able to afford in Nashville, Tennessee, $1,800 a month for a studio apartment for one person?
Yeah.
Why would they want to live with you? Like what? How much do you think the median income is to justify building 700, 800 units that are all priced like that and above? And none of them are ever interested in being like, I could make this affordable so people could actually buy it. Like, they're not concerned about that. And it amazes me.
That's what's happening in like a large scale in New York City, where they have entire apartment buildings where it's like maybe a handful of occupants because people can't afford it. And they're
Yeah.
still like, oh, but the issue is that we need more housing because supply and demand. And I hate when people pull economic terms out of their butt to say
Mm-hmm.
things that don't mean the thing that it is. Like when people talk about capitalism, it's like this
Mm-hmm.
isn't true capitalism, because capitalism talks about let the market decide. Well, we're not letting the market decide. That wasn't part of what is happening now. We,
Yeah.
like anti like monopoly policies and things like that. Like it's kind of been out the window.
I've said this a couple of times. Like, capitalism isn't bad. Bad capitalists are bad because capitalism is it's a structure, it's an idea. But like you said, like the market isn't just cars and tickets and glasses and things you purchase. Like the market can extend to any sort of exchange because an economy is just value exchange. And it speaks to just like the human experience. What value am I getting from society? None. But I'm supposed to pay into it. Well, I'm not getting anything out of it. So why am I putting anything into it? And even when you ask that question, you've got a massive problem because even if you only just pare back a little bit, get what you get now, right? Like
Yeah.
Korea's like birth rate decline, Japan's birth rate decline, all of these things are like very extreme instantiations of something that is happening across the like America's birth rate is like just above the point where it's technically a problem. And it's funny to me that the only people who are like calling attention to it are the worst kind of people who do not have the solution and are never going to look for it because they're just like, people need to breed. It's like, no, 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 that's not how this works. We're not monkeys. We're not rats. We're people. We're
It's
humans.
giving eugenics. It's
You
giving
see?
eugenics.
Exactly. Right? It's like the new eugenics. And it's like, how do you not see what's happened? It's bewildering in a way that baffles because it's like, this is such a simple fix. We just have to care. That's it. We just have to care. We have to be willing to put that care before other things, right? If
Yeah.
you,
If it's like a good faith effort and there's
mm-hmm,
actual resources getting into actual human hands and stuff,
mm-hmm,
how would it not work? Just to bring it back to the 4B movement, I think there is a certain level of reckoning that has to happen with the level of care and work that goes into every single person, every single child who grows up to be an adult, and every single adult who loses abilities and gets old. But there's a certain amount of like government incentives that could be helpful, but I also think if it's already at a crisis level, it's a little too late to change attitudes for that whole generation of people. This has to be proactive. It's not on the women of South Korea to fix this. I think there's a certain level of integrity and dignity that each person we need to recognize has. This is a choice that you can make and it should be yours.
that's probably why I'm so in support of it because it's not something, it's not, this is not the problem. The problem is not the movement, right? The movement exists because of the problem.
Yeah.
And the problem has to be fixed somewhere else. The movement makes sense to me because it's a reaction to the problem. And if you address the problem, the movement does what it needs to do, right? It appears, it disappears, it modifies, it changes.
Yeah, I think that it's a type of audacity that I admire, where you are finally taking accountability for your own agency and saying, this is not my sole responsibility to fix. I think that level of agency is really admirable, honestly. I think the movement does a good job in pointing our attention at some larger things that we're feeling globally. I've been feeling really depressed about the state of feminism as of late. First Trump election where he won, I think the Women's March was supposed to be this culmination of the Me Too movement, and like finally we're standing up, we're doing the thing, and it's proven to be really ineffective overall. And that's a lesson that, you know, people already had known, but I guess people are also just now learning. The discourse around it has been really discouraging. It's just been a really tough time. But I think something that has given me perspective is that it's a recent video that I saw by Elliot saying called Biden.mp4. And he kind of deep dives into Biden. All this to say, like, one presidency won't necessarily be the end all be all of every feminist cause. And I don't think the alarmist way that they try to pitch against Trump, where they're like, it's dystopia, it's Gilead, and all this and that, I don't think that was effective because a lot of people, especially women of color, currently live in that dystopia where they're being forcefully sterilized, they're being forcefully separated from children and family. That is the dystopia that is a lot of people's existence currently. So it just felt like it was ringing false. But I think the larger thing I want to get at is that, like, I feel a renewed sense of like, we know what we want, we know the steps, we know who's in the way, let's get to it. You know, I'm not going to stop
Yes.
working because the results, people are like, oh, I'm grieving. Like, sure, take your moment or whatever. But also, I am eyeing which battles I want to fight. Like, I'm already like looking at it, I'm
Mm-hmm.
already like thinking about it.
Preach, Sister
A,
Lee.
something that I really value about the way we talk between you and me, JT, we tend to know that we're coming from a place of assuming that our friendship is intact and we'll stay to, you know, we'll stay friends, and we have each other's best interests in mind. And that's always been just so like healing for me, to have friendships across gender, across geographical locations and all that, that I think challenge me, push me, but all, you know, at the end of the day are rooting for me, you know? And I see that with everything that we do together. So that's cool.
You got tears again.
God.
The people who are just listening have not probably, because I didn't say anything, but I was crying earlier a little bit. I got some
Yeah.
more tears.
Yeah. We love the feels here. We don't shy
Thank you.
away from it.
We don't.
Yeah.
We
And I think
don't.
that's important.
It's definitely important. Don't forget, thank you for listening, and we are here out of love. Let us know what's bothering you, Baltimore. Maybe we can address it next time.
Yeah, and send us an email at what's.wrong.bemore@gmail.com, or DM us on Instagram at what's.wrong.bemore, BMORE. And, you know, if you have suggestions, we are accessible through Patreon as well. So until then, until next time, we hope you take care and find little ways to indulge, to really feel like you're living the life you want to live.
Yeah, feel human, you know?
Yeah,
Take
yeah.
some time and really get in touch with your own humanity. Go and touch a tree.